To the unfamiliar, a film such as Man Ray's L'Étoile de Mer can be difficult to decipher. The enigmatic imagery, the seemingly nonsensical text by Robert Desnos from which it is derived, these appear to hint at some narrative or deeper meaning, but not one which is immediately apparent. This of course is quite intentional, and is integral to the ideas and creative techniques espoused by its creators. This is surrealism after all. And while Un Chien Andalou and L'Âge d'Or, which Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dalí produced together, have come to represent the surrealist movement in cinema above all others, the less well-known L'Étoile de Mer is also one of the most significant exemplars of surrealist cinema, the product of another pair of the movement's leading luminaries. It can also be considered Man Ray's most complete cinematic work, although once one understands the ideals of the surrealist group it could be imagined that he might have resisted the implications of such a definition. While the film may of course be appreciated of itself in the abstract, as its creators intended, if one desires to better understand what it may represent and the creative choices employed, awareness of the cultural currents which gave rise to it becomes necessary. The formal inception of Surrealism as an artistic movement is generally dated to the publication of the first Surrealist manifesto by writer and poet André Breton in 1924. The word Surrealism was coined by the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. It first appeared in the program notes he wrote for the Ballet Parade in 1917. Breton had been a friend of Apollinaire, and adopted his term both because it was fitting, and as an homage. Naturally enough, surrealism did not spring from a vacuum, hardly anything ever does. There is a certain overlap with Dadaism, and other similar movements current at the time. Many of the surrealists including Breton, Desnos and Man Ray had previously been Dadaists. Indeed, in the popular imagination the distinction between these two movements can be vague at best. While there is common ground in the general aesthetic, the intellectual underpinnings are quite different. Dada billed itself as anti-art. It rejected the idea that art should have meaning or even make sense. Meaninglessness, absurdity and chance were its main tenets. This was a direct reaction to what its adherents saw as the meaningless and absurd violence of the First World War. By contrast, Surrealism did not seek to deny the meaning in art, but was focused on the concept of reaching into the depths of the subconscious mind to channel hidden meaning and a freer form of creativity. The study of dreams becomes central, since dreams were seen as a window to the subconscious mind. This interest in the subconscious is directly derived from the theories of Sigmund Freud, which were gaining wider dissemination at that time. Thus the movement was not a continuation of Dada, but marked out a distinct new direction of its own. As the author of the Surrealist manifestos, and through force of personality, the leader and driving force of the Surrealists as a group was André Breton. This too in contrast to the largely leaderless and anti-authoritarian Dadaists. Originally conceived as a literary movement, Surrealism found its greatest success and most lasting influence in the visual arts and film. While this influence was widespread and continues to this day, it should be noted that the historical movement was mostly confined to Paris in the period from 1924 until its members were dispersed by the events of the Second World War. The term is fairly loosely applied today. The key distinction is generally the same as what sets it apart from Dada, in that the ideas of the historical movement were tied quite specifically to its basis in Sigmund Freud's theories of dreams and the unconscious, while much that bills itself as, or is labeled as, surrealist today does not share that basis. It is these ideas which provided the intellectual foundation for its characteristic style, and the techniques employed by the group were developed as an outgrowth of those ideas. A second stream of influence, which was not as integral initially, but grew in strength as time went on, was Marxist philosophy and politics. The political aspect was pursued assiduously by Breton, who saw himself as a revolutionary, but was not embraced by the group as a whole. The increasing politicization of the group would in fact be at the root of the final falling out between Desnos and Breton in 1929. Prior to devoting himself to literature, Breton had studied medicine. As is so often the case, this was at the insistence of his father, who wanted his son to pursue a respectable career. The outbreak of the First World War found the young student serving as a psychiatric aide in a military hospital. The professor under whom he worked and studied introduced him to the writings of Sigmund Freud. Young Breton was captivated. Freud's seminal book The Interpretation of Dreams of 1899 exerting particular influence. In this work Freud legitimizes the idea that dreams are a window to the subconscious, and thus a valid reflection of hidden, or suppressed, emotions and desires. Breton's work at the hospital centered around the care of shell-shocked soldiers, which gave him the opportunity to try his own hand at applying psychiatric processes. He came to identify the patient's visions and ravings as representing outpourings of the subconscious, expressions of the imagination freed from the constraints of the rational mind. As a writer and poet, the potential for adapting these principles to form the basis for artistic production quickly became apparent. As he himself described this period in later life, "I was sent to a center for disabled men sent home due to mental illness, including a number of acutely insane men, as well as more doubtful cases brought up on charges on which a medical opinion was called for. The time I spent there and what I saw was of signal importance in my life, and had a decisive influence in the development of my thought. That is where I could experiment on patients, seeing the nature of diagnosis and psychoanalysis, and in particular, the recording of dreams and free association. These materials were from the beginning at the heart of Surrealism. The vivid and disturbing imagery which came spontaneously to the patients as a result of their conditions appeared as a fantastical new creative world to be explored. One which Breton felt went beyond what he himself had been able to create to that point. As a friend of Breton recorded, Breton was deeply disturbed to see that the inmates were greater poets than he. Theirs was a terrifying cannon burst. He forced me to hear the sound of dementia. This apparent liberation of the imagination from rational convention as a result of the abeyance of the conscious rational mind is what held the most appeal." In the first manifesto of 1924, Breton defines Surrealism as pure psychic automatism by which it is intended to express, either verbally or in writing, the true function of thought. Thought dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason, and outside all aesthetic or moral preoccupations. It could also be described as stream of consciousness, avoiding any of the filtering or corrections which the conscious mind automatically applies. The automatism of which he writes came to consist of several techniques which all had the same ultimate goal, to allow the unfiltered manifestation of the unconscious mind. As many of their writings demonstrate, the Surrealists held some scientific pretensions in their work. Psychoanalysis was still a relatively new science, and while Freud's studies of dreams formed the theoretical basis for Surrealism, it was perhaps inevitable that the group's understanding of those ideas was simplistic, or rather, that it was tailored to suit artistic purposes. The underlying intentions were simply too divergent. Freud's research aimed to better understand the mind for therapeutic purposes, to be able to cure disturbances of the psyche as a part of medical practice. Whereas the Surrealists embraced such disturbances for their own sake, as pathways to the new creative possibilities they felt were opened by them. The Surrealist interest in dreams and the unconscious was ultimately more aesthetic than scientific. To further illustrate the point, in his later manifesto, The Quinquagenary of Hysteria, Breton states that, hysteria is not a pathological phenomenon, but can be considered in every respect a supreme means of expression. Salvador Dali, whose work is perhaps the most overtly Freudian of all the Surrealists, wrote that, Surrealism attempts to deliver the subconscious from the principle of reality, thus finding a source of splendid and delirious images. He refers to realism as a mental prison, and Surrealism is its liberation. The rational mind, part of whose function is to set firm boundaries which should not be breached, is seen as an obstacle to the full flowering of the imagination. Reason and rationality are to be circumvented. Only by accessing the subconscious can the artist free himself from such limitations. They sought to convey a dreamlike quality in their works, thus the unconscious mind and irrational thoughts were to be embraced in to better achieve it. This was intended, as Breton had written, to approach pure thought, undiluted by reason or any other moral or aesthetic criteria. The techniques of automatism which were central in the 20s and 30s were designed as attempts to get closer to the experience of a person suffering from psychotic episodes or hysteria. This was seen as a release for the psyche, in opposition to the rational world. The primacy given to dreams stemmed from the fact that they are supposedly outside the reach of conscious thought. It isn't hard to see why Freud the scientist and physician couldn't quite approve of all this. He never really trusted or liked Surrealism. To the friend who had arranged the meeting with Dali he wrote that, "They have apparently chosen me as their patron saint, but mused that, perhaps I am not destined to understand it." The quasi-veneration directed towards him by many of these artists was a point of mild perplexity, and the few direct interactions between him and surrealists such as Breton and Dali were not deemed to be successful ones. Robert Desnos' family came from a background in commerce, and he was originally destined to follow that path. However, already in his teens he was writing and publishing his first poems. Some of his earliest poetry appeared in the Dadaist magazine Literature in 1919. He was a friend of Breton from early on, and went on to become one of the founding members of Surrealism after the break from Dada in 1924. Indeed, Breton hailed Desnos as Surrealism's prophet. The automatic writing technique which held such primacy with the group in those years came naturally to him. It is recounted that even in noisy cafes, Desnos had but to close his eyes and he would enter a trance-like state and freely extemporize in verse. As Breton describes in the Surrealist Manifesto, "He, who, more than any of us, has perhaps got closest to the surrealist truth, he, who, in his still unpublished works and in the course of the numerous experiments he has been a party to, has fully justified the hope I placed in Surrealism and leads me to believe that a great deal more will still come of it." Desnos speaks Surrealist, at will. His extraordinary agility in orally following his thought is worth as much to us as any number of splendid speeches which are lost, Desnos having better things to do than record them. He reads himself like an open book, and does nothing to retain the pages, which fly away in the windy wake of his life. The creation of L'Étoile de Mer came close to the end of Desnos' formal association with the Surrealist movement. Desnos was averse to any kind of hierarchical order or authority, which inevitably led to some rancor with Breton, who had an authoritarian streak, and whose political leanings became increasingly militant over time. By 1929 the two had broken off over disagreements regarding Surrealism's involvement in politics. Breton formally expelled Desnos from the group in the second Surrealist Manifesto of that year, to which Desnos would respond that, "Surrealism has fallen into the public domain. For the Surrealists there is only one reality, complete, open to everyone." Man Ray began his artistic pursuits as a painter, but already before coming to France he had begun the experimentation with photography for which he has become best known. He moved to Paris from the United States in the early 1920s, where he was quickly drawn into the Dadaist circle. He became known as a Dadaist photographer, and in this period developed the photogrammatic technique which he dubbed the rayogram. It was Breton's admiration of the way Man Ray's rayograms transformed ordinary objects in surprising, one might say surreal ways which brought him into the fold. Ray liked to describe himself as a painter of light, since the rayogram technique was based on solarization of the negative. After the break with Dada, Man Ray also became a founding member of Surrealism. His photos and portraits document the early Surrealist movement in Paris. One of his abstract photos was the first image to appear in the magazine La Révolution Surréaliste, which launched not long after the publication of Breton's manifesto in 1924. while emerging from the traditional arts of literature, painting and sculpture, from its inception photography and film, were also important parts of the movement. Indeed, it is the visual art of Surrealism which has thus far stood the test of time, most of the literature having fallen by the wayside. Man Ray's first film creation is the brief, Le Retour à la Raison, The Return to Reason, of 1923. Its genesis was as unconventional as the resulting film itself. Tristan Tzara, the closest thing to a leader that the Dada movement had, wanted to screen a film as part of the upcoming Dadaist exhibition, the Soirée du Cœur à Barbe, Night of the Bearded Heart, and announced that a new film by Man Ray was to be premiered. Of course, no such film existed yet. Thus forcibly inspired, Man Ray had to complete the work in the limited time given him. The resulting film is entirely abstract, and carries into the cinematic medium the technical innovations which he had already experimented with in photography. He called it a cinereogram. The screening did not go smoothly. The numerous splices in the film reel did not hold, and the projection had to be restarted multiple times, leading to audience unrest. The evening was memorable for a number of reasons. During the performance of Tzara's play, The Gas Heart, a small riot broke out, during which one of the actors had his arm broken. The assailants included André Breton and Robert Desnos, who had leapt onto the stage. They were soon escorted away by the police. Tzara and Breton had once been collaborators, but from 1921 on their relationship soured over growing ideological differences. By this point the two could no longer abide each other. The rift formed at this event was the final straw which led Breton and his followers to go their own way and establish the Surrealist movement. It is likely no coincidence that the Night of the Bearded Heart ended up being the last Dadaist event. Man Ray's next film was avant-garde of 1926. More ambitious both in duration and in its use of live-action sequences, it carries on the experiments begun in Le Retour à la Raison. The surreal dreamlike effects are more developed. As he later described it in his autobiography, there was no scenario, all would be improvised. It is intended to be viewed as a series of dreamlike sequences without apparent logic, and complete disregard for conventional storytelling. This is also the first film where he applied the label, ciné-poème, the idea being that the interplay of images forms the poetic content. It should be remembered that most of these artists came from the world of painting, and saw film as a sort of extension of that medium. Traditional dramatic concepts of narrative were not central to their interests, indeed they were often avoided. It is the sequence of images and associations derived from them which forms the narration. This is true of nearly all the early avant-garde abstract films. The first such experiments are generally attributed to the futurists Bruno Corra and Arnaldo Gina, with Walter Ruttmann and Hans Richter being among the important innovators who preceded Man Ray. These all share similar aesthetic and artistic concerns, usually relying on animation techniques. Unique to Man Ray is his background in photography, which allowed him to manipulate the images through technical innovations in the processing of the film medium itself. Incidentally, the first screening of avant-garde also did not go smoothly. A member of the audience began to complain that the film was giving him a headache, and when another audience member attempted to quiet him, it erupted into a larger fight, which turned into a riot, and once again police had to be called in to stop it. L'Étoile de Mer is Man Ray's third film, and represents a marked departure from his previous two efforts. It is also the first of his films whose first screening does not appear to have been accompanied by a riot. If this came as a disappointment or not has not been recorded. L'Étoile de Mer is described as a poem, by Robert Desnos, as seen by Man Ray. The scenario is Man Ray's visual interpretation of Desnos' poem, once again dubbed a ciné-poème. This is the first of his films which has a scenario, and a basis in extraneous material. It can be seen in part as an attempt to fuse poetry and cinema. A comparison can be drawn to the form of the tone poem in music, where the composition has its genesis in a non-musical source, but uses only musical means to express the idea. The text of the poem appears through the film as its intertitles. It is characteristically surrealist, with its extensive symbolic wordplay, unfolding as a stream of consciousness. Part of Freud's dream theories, the concept of free association, where the mind's censorship is intentionally circumvented, is clearly evidence here. The poem, and hence the film, is in this sense the retelling of a dream. Man Ray's previous two films are more correctly categorized as Dadaist, but the significant stylistic developments in L'Étoile de Mer place it firmly as a surrealist work. The unique look of much of the film is achieved by employing a gelatin dry plate process which gives the image the effect of textured glass, or even suggesting the textures of a painting. This contributes to the surrealist dreamscape atmosphere by obscuring detail. On a more practical level, the obscuring of the image helped to resolve concerns over potential censorship of the nude scenes. In contrast, there are moments where the image is in focus, no doubt to draw the viewer's attention, the same way such contrasts are used in painting and photography. In this day and age of ubiquitous photography and digital editing, it can be easy to lose sight of how revolutionary such techniques were at the time. How to interpret the film? It defies easy analysis. Many commentators have put forth Freudian interpretations, which of course makes perfect sense in relation to its place in surrealism. These interpretations are usually complex, and while often intriguing, are ultimately speculative, since nothing left to us by Man Ray and Robert Desnos can prove what the pair really had in mind. As Desnos later described it, from this poem, simple as love, simple as a hello, simple and terrible as goodbye, Man Ray had fashioned a world which no longer belonged to me, and not entirely to him. We may focus on a few points which can be considered explicit, since they are manifest within either Desnos' text or Ray's visuals, which are not always in alignment. A common, and typically Freudian theory, is that the male protagonist is suffering from castration anxiety. The seemingly casual reference to the ancient Phrygian goddess Cybele in the intertitle Cybele would support this. This is fairly transparent, considering that one of the unique features of her cult was a eunuch mendicant priesthood which may have practiced ritual self-castration. The scene of the woman going up the stairs, wielding a raised knife, would also tie into this anxiety. Yet the man's interest in the woman is conflicted. In multiple scenes his attention is drawn to the starfish in a jar rather than to her. Since the starfish represents love lost, does this imply that the man is consumed by the past, or obsessed with the unattainable, and thus is unable to see what is before him in the present? Later we see the woman dressed in what appears to be Phrygian costume, denoted by the typical Phrygian cap, which has long been a symbol of liberty. The symbolic significance of this distinctive headgear would not be lost on a French audience, as it is a feature of the figure of Mayan, who has been the national personification of the French Republic since the Revolution. Does this represent the man's liberation from his anxieties, or perhaps from his ties to the past? But only too late, as in the last scene it appears that the present has passed him by. If these interpretations are at all valid, to what degree did the creators expect the audience to intuit them? Man Ray contradicted attempted interpretations years later by stating, it was a poem, contrary to all surrealist poems, where nothing happens, full of hallucinatory imagery. A film without a story. The starfish is a symbol for who knows what. But the meaning of that symbol seems fairly well established, and with a bit of deduction can be traced to its specific end. Desnos said that to him the starfish represented lost love. Considering the time period, this lost love almost certainly must have been his great passion of those years, the singer Yvonne Georges. He first came to know her around 1924, but his love was unrequited. Georges was not in the least bit interested in him, but over the next few years he dedicated at least 2 volumes of poems to her, a Les Mystérieux of 1926 and Les Ténèbres of 1927. Desnos' predilection for wordplay is in evidence throughout his work, and L'Étoile de Mer is no exception with its obscure references and invented word combinations. Desnos always referred to Georges as L'Étoile, the star, and it seems that her repertoire, which has largely been lost, had a focus on maritime folklore, telling of the loves and tribulations of sailors, and, there, we have a reference to the sea. Thus, one can conjecture that the Star of the Sea, which is the literal translation of the phrase L'Étoile de Mer, represents Georges, and hence the starfish's symbolic representation of lost love. Quite specifically Desnos' love for Yvonne Georges. The actual starfish in a jar used in the film was found by Desnos at a second-hand shop. He recounted how it immediately came to symbolize lost love to him, and that he kept it as a souvenir of his passion for Yvonne Georges. It was to him the physical manifestation of his Étoile de Mer. Regardless of how one chooses to interpret, or if one chooses to interpret the film at all, it remains a testament to a moment in time, with its own unique confluence of ideas and influences. And while the film is not widely known to the general public, the influence of its effects and techniques is easily detectable in the work of subsequent generations of filmmakers.